We're about to enter a building today that many corporate people would hope they would never have to go into. These guys are forensic accountants. They specialise in pulling apart companies and dealing with companies that have collapsed or gone bankrupt. And what we want to try and find out is from these people, maybe how to do them out of a job. What can companies do or teams do or leaders do to try and avoid getting to the stage where it is actually too late? So come with me and we're going to try and find out what makes them tick. Now I hope you never have to come in here, but just in case you do, or just in case you're getting close to it, let's have a look and see what we can do to make it better.
Come this way. I'm a forensic accountant here at Ferrier Hodgson, so I like finding people who do bad things.
Could you try and explain to us exactly what you do in a language that most of us can understand?
I'm generally called in to assist in situations where there's some form of financial distress or some form of financial failure. Economy is considered to be a human body, then cash must be the blood, and that is what feeds the individual cells, the individual businesses, which employ people and allow the economy to grow and to thrive and to prosper. Using that analogy, the banks, secured creditors, must be the distribution network. They're the veins that deliver the cash to where it needs to go. So they're the veins that take the blood throughout the system. I like to think of a bad loan or a failing business as being like a blood clot, and it's my job to actually unclot that blood and release that cash back into the system, either by making a return back to the bank so that they can lend that money on to somebody else, or by actually resolving that business's issues and returning that business to health and viability.
What sort of preventative measures can companies take to avoid the blood clot in the first place and hope that they'll never have to come knocking on your door?
There are a few really basic principles that are quite timeless that relate to maintaining a viable business model and maintaining a viable business and a viable commercial operation and keeping it healthy. I think probably the first principle is to make sure you're in business for a valid reason, to make sure you've actually got a viable fundamental business model. One that's not propped up by government grants or one that's not propped up by easy borrowing. If you've got a business that doesn't actually generate a profit or can't generate its own cash flow to sustain its operations, and it needs to either borrow money to keep its doors open, or it needs grants from the government or something along those lines, then there isn't a fundamentally viable business. It's existing at the sufferance of other people or by other organisations propping it up.
So the end is almost inevitable.
Absolutely, it's inevitable, and that business also never has control over its own destiny. So making sure that there is a viable business model, and that leads into my next principle. In order to have a sustainable business, you need to look beyond your immediate business cycle. You need to look beyond your immediate circumstances.
So you get called in when the cycle changes,
yes,
and people are still living in yesterday's cycle.
Or they're not prepared for it. I think one of the other phrases that I like to use is challenge your business before the market does. Sometimes the business or the business place or the business environment moves away from the particular business that you operate in. So that's another way. That's not something that's dependent on business cycles. That can be some kind of...
It's still a cycle, isn't it?
It's still a cycle, yeah. Absolutely. It could be some form of catastrophic technology change. What effectively happens is that your business is no longer particularly relevant or as relevant to the marketplace that you're operating in. Now, that management team might think that there are certain things they can do with their business or certain things they can tweak or change in order to improve performance or in order to save the company and sail through these issues. But if the market's moved away, those changes and that tweaking that the management team thinks they can do won't work anymore, which means that the world has moved on beyond that particular business. That's another aspect of not looking beyond your particular circumstances at the time. You need to look beyond not only the business and the economic cycle, but your particular product cycle. Basically, you need to be looking forward. Moving on to one of the ways that you actually know whether you've got a viable business model is knowing how you are and knowing where you're going. So the only way you can know about the health of your business is to have good reporting systems and to have really good financial controls and be able to know at any moment, what is turnover, what are sales, what profits are we making, and also to have a good and strong forecasting process so that you know exactly where the business is going. Forecasting is also a wonderful tool. It lets you do scenario planning. So in the event that sales drop by 40%, for example, you can model exactly what will happen as a result of that and then come up with some plans or some contingencies.
So a good company may be surprised or shocked by a market downturn, but at the same time is not going to be completely left helpless.
Absolutely, and having the opportunity and having the foresight.
Because they've been through this before,
Yes,
mentally.
exactly. And they've done some strategic planning or scenario planning around what to do. And there are many very successful companies around the world that actually operate that way, and they've got teams of people that work on worst-case scenarios and how would they manage them. The next, I think, principle that is important for staying healthy and keeping a business healthy is to communicate effectively, but communicate habitually. Make communication a habit. That relates to employees, it relates to suppliers, it relates to your customers. And I'll give you an example. If you have a company that is struggling financially, right? Rather than actually when customers ring up and say, or suppliers ring up and say, when am I going to get paid for that invoice? Rather than everything's fine, don't worry, we'll pay you next week, we'll pay you next month, to actually be more honest and straightforward and say, look, we're going through some financial difficulties at this stage, and we'll have to pay you off in instalments, or can you give us some breathing space? Can I pay you at 90 days instead of 30 days? That kind of approach is generally much better accepted by people rather than trying to conceal that there's a problem. The final issue, or the final principle I think that's really important, is to stay healthy. And sort of bringing it back to a medical analogy. But generally one of the causes of business failure often is because there is one person who's pivotal or key to management of that business, and that person becomes ill and is away from work for 3 months or 6 months, and during that time their brother or their second in command or one of their employees takes over the business, and while that person is in charge, the business is run into the ground. Businesses are often finding their working capitals being dried up by directors or management teams who've got unfortunate gambling habits.